KCOG Commission will be here to talk about those things. I'm going to try and keep it not too long so we can have plenty of dialogue afterwards. Very much appreciate you coming tonight.
The question is, will it be as exciting as zoning?
Well, let's make afterwards we can take a vote. Which one was the most exciting? Russ, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, evening everyone. So I'm actually going to do just a little advertisement for our next big planning event and then kick it over to Tom and kind of run up tonight's program. But so I mentioned this last week. You'll see postcards go out very soon, but we're going to be right on Market Street at 2017 Market Street, set up with a studio, and we'll have the whole planning team there for a solid week. So mark your calendars. Don't get overwhelmed. You can come as little or as much as you'd like. But we'll also. There we go. So this is the more detailed schedule. So the way this works, which I think is really important, is so it's a pop-up. Just put all this together.
That's the back.
So the pop-up design studio will be there 9 a.m. to 9:10 p.m. So really just come anytime, poke your head in, look at the drawings, the plans, talk to one of the team members. So that's sort of, come whenever you want. The public sessions, this darker blue block here, those are like the main events, the big headline events. So we'll have a kickoff, which is on Thursday night. A sort of midpoint check-in, which is really about kind of really looking at all the process drawings and all the plans in process. That's Sunday night, and that will be really informal. We'll have food, should be nice and casual and fun. And then Wednesday the 9th will be the kind of wrap-up presentation, which will really be a more formal presentation that we'll have here in this room that will show all the progress we've made. And then, so that's the three main events. And then this light blue bar is if you want to talk about something very specific, we're going to dive into those topics and really talk about the plans and drawings, code, all sorts of ideas around each of those topics at those specific times. So if you show up to mobility and parking and you want to talk about open space, I'm going to ask you to not talk about open space. But the idea here is that if you really want to come and talk about a specific issue, and you can you can't make that time frame, come anytime to the studio and we'll talk to you about it. But those meetings are really going to be to dive in deep on those topics. So that's how the sort of the design studio and the master planning week is going to take place. So keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending this out shortly. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tom, and he'll talk to us about tonight's program.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Feronti with Mashpee Commons. Thank you all for joining us tonight to talk about infrastructure and systems planning. A very exciting topic to spend a couple hours on a Tuesday night. This is the rescheduled one from one of our multiple nor'easters in March, so thank you all for taking the time. So as we talk about infrastructure and systems planning, there's a variety of aspects of that we'll cover tonight. We have two very esteemed individuals tonight that will help us look at both the local aspects of that and the regional aspects when we look at the town of Mashpee and Barnstable County as a whole. We have Steve Tupper from the Cape Cod Commission and Andrew Gottlieb from the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. Steve is the Transportation Program Manager at the Cape Cod Commission. Steve graduated with his bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2009 and completed his master's in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2011. He's been with the Cape Cod Commission since 2011, specializing in transportation planning and support. Cape Cod Commission Transportation staff provides technical expertise in transportation and traffic-related matters for the Commission, its staff, and the 15 Cape Cod towns. Andrew Gottlieb is the Executive Director of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. He's also the former head of Barnstable County's Water Protection Collaborative. Andrew graduated from Harvard University with his bachelor's in government and later completed his MBA in public and nonprofit management from Boston University. As Executive Director of Association to Preserve Cape Cod, Andrew is responsible for determining the focus of the advocacy and educational efforts, implementing programs, coordinating fundraising and membership activities, and the overall management of the organization's daily activities. With more than 30 years of environmental protection experience in government and elected terms in the municipal office, he also has extensive experience working at all levels of government, including local, county, and state. He's a Mashpee resident. He's currently serving as a member of the Mashpee Board of Selectmen. So with that, I'll pass it off to Steve to get us started.
Thank you very much. So again, Steve Tupper. I'm an engineer, but I'll try not to get into all the data and all the analysis. But if anyone wants to talk data, I can certainly do that after the presentation. But today we'll take a high-level look. We're looking at transportation as a system. So we'll start with a focus on the regional system, and then as with all transportation, we'll end up getting into some of the local issues that I'm sure you all are very familiar with in this area. So I'll first talk about some of the transportation systems on Cape Cod. Some of those you're familiar with, some of those maybe are less intuitive. We'll talk about regional transportation at planning and how we do that at the Cape Cod Commission. Jump into how we come up with locally driven transportation solutions. So you'll see some examples from the area that you may be familiar with and kind of get to the idea of how we get to solutions to some of these challenges. And I'll close with a vision. You'll see it's not transportation vision, so you'll see there's a very specific reason for that as we go started. So first we'll talk about systems. So this is a transportation system I think you're probably all familiar with. This is the road network. 3,800 miles of roadway, 125 traffic signals, 25 rotaries, roundabouts. We can talk about the difference between those at different times. And 109 bridges, important to think about when you think about some of these weather events and the challenges there. And certainly the canal bridges being a challenge in everyone's mind today. This is kind of a high-level look at the road network. Certainly we're located on a transportation hub in terms of the roadway network, but Mashpee Commons and the activities around here are also the hub in terms of other networks as well. So I guess free food to anyone who can guess this, so that's an easy one. This is a transit network. So these are the routes run by the Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority and also some of the intercity bus transportation. Over 1 million riders a year on the Regional Transit Authority's buses. So maybe each of you don't use this, but it's a very important mode for a lot of Cape Codders, a lot of people visiting the region, so another network in the area. When you start to get a little more local in terms of the network, this is one that everyone has probably used in one capacity or another, the SIDEWALK network. So everyone's journey starts as a pedestrian, and when you're making a little bit longer of a trip, these SIDEWALK networks are certainly important. And connecting these to the activity center is certainly critical. And the final one, maybe the most challenging, you'll see in green things that are built, in yellow-orange color, things that are coming very soon. That's the paved path network. And you'll see starting to get together into a spine across Cape Cod. It's not built out the way the road network is, but this is an important asset for many people in our community. I think people usually think of these as recreational trails, but they're really important for transportation as well. There's a lot of folks that use these to get to their jobs, to get to grocery stores, so it's important to think about them not just in a recreational sense, but connecting communities by many different modes. So when you start to combine all of these different systems together, you get something that's very complicated. So this is where we put together all these different aspects of the transportation network and really try to think about Cape Cod as an entire system. Certainly the first thing that comes to mind is traffic issues surrounding developments, but it really has to do with all of the ways to get people to and from places. So that's really what we talk about in regional transportation planning, is setting that system context for everything we do. And really it's not about trying to get people in a car, get people in a bicycle. It's really about getting people to places. So you'll hear this a couple times through the presentation. It's really about improving people's access between those places they want to get and where they're starting their journey. So it really doesn't matter what mode, but just making sure that those connections are there for the people looking to make those destinations. So I'll give you a couple of specific examples about things we do in terms of regional transportation planning. One that folks are probably most familiar with is analyzing the network and figuring out where there's capacity. So it certainly you've all experienced issues where there's more cars than the road can handle. You've got those long traffic queues, or maybe intersections that are very hazardous in terms of safety. You see a lot of crashes at those locations. So really analyzing the network and finding those deficiencies in the existing network is probably the most traditional thing folks are familiar with. We also focus on identifying gaps, what's not there that really should be there. So we'll give you some examples of that tonight to try to make those connections. And then finally, when we're talking about transportation investment, we're talking about big dollars. A single traffic signal is on the order of $2 to $3 million. Typical transportation projects are $10+ million. So when towns and the state are putting up those sort of funds for improvements, we want to make sure we understand what are the benefits. So we're really careful to try to quantify the benefits of those improvements in the area. So I'll give you a concrete example of each of those. So we'll zoom into a location that I'm probably pretty familiar here. The orange shaded area is all of the activities in and around Mashpee Commons, the community center, the library right here, all of these things that really define a place. So you can think of that orange shaded area as a place that folks want to get to. So I want to talk about the people. Where are the people? At least locally, you can see all those white dots there. Those are all the residences around the area. So somehow those people want to get to this place. Probably, most people are going to take their car today. We'll be realistic about it. People may want to try other modes, but still auto is dominant right now. But things are changing. So here's the regional sidewalk network. So if you're fortunate enough to live within walking distance, there's some sidewalks out there to get you there. I know the Commons and the town and the state have been working to extend those. But for now, you're starting to see connections to some of the neighborhoods. But what happens when you start extending those? So the teal line there is a project that the town of Mashpee is currently designing, a Route 151 improvement project. It's going to bring multimodal accommodations all the way along Route 151. So with that, you can see it's really starting to connect up lots more neighborhoods here. Now maybe it would be a bit far for folks to walk, but certainly you can walk. You could ride your bike there with the improvements that are proposed. Maybe you're not going to go to Stop and Shop and do all your shopping there, but maybe you work at Stop and Shop. So that's a great way for you to get to work without a car, either by choice or by necessity. So it provides a lot more connections. This is an example of an improvement that you can really start to see is building connections between people and places. So let's jump ahead 5 years. That project does have funding. Almost $13 million for the project, so you'll see those big ticket items here. 5 years down the road, that will be built, and that's great. We'll connect a bunch more communities. But there'll still be challenges out there. So certainly, if you're heading further east down Route 28, you'll start to see some more communities over there. And also, Route 28 is a very important corridor in terms of commercial activity up and down the region. We see a lot of bicyclists on Route 28 trying to get to their jobs. These are the people working at the restaurant establishments that may or may not have opportunities for vehicles. It could be the seasonal workers that come each year. So providing those opportunities on Route 28 is very important. And this section right here, between the Mashpee Rotary and Quiniquisette, is really a key spot. Most of the way along 28, there's alternate routes. People can go through neighborhoods, go through quieter streets. This is it in terms of traveling east and west in this area. We are defined by water, and water in this case provides a barrier in terms of transportation. So the Commission has been looking at a number of designs trying to fix that gap, working with the state. And as Mashpee Commons continues to develop, we'll certainly be an important partner in terms of changes and trying to make all those connections there. So those are some of the less obvious things. Now we'll jump to the elephant in the room, probably the obvious thing, the Mashpee Road. Capacity issues, safety issues, we're all aware of that. So certainly that's something that in coordination with the folks at the Commons we will be taking a look at, and you'll see specific reference to that in a little while, so I'll hold off on that. But from a regional perspective, we try to identify what are these big regional issues, what are these connections that don't exist, what are these things we really need to focus on. And then we start to try to come up with locally driven transportation solutions. So it's great to look at these things on a map from a regional perspective, but when you start talking about changes to the roadway, you're impacting people, you're impacting properties, you're impacting people's commutes. So what we really try to do is in all of our projects, really try to go out to the community and figure out what is needed and what is acceptable to the community. So we start in the office by putting together a host of maps, trying to understand the underlying data. You can get some information from there. Certainly engineers love to dig into the data there, but that can only get you so far. So next we always head out into the field. It's one thing to read about a safety issue, another thing to see the results of some of those crashes. Certainly we all know cyclists are out on 28. Seeing someone trying to ride down 28, it leaves a little bit of a different impression. Congestion, I think that's something that's probably not as surprising driving into the meeting today. And there's some other things that us engineers might call challenges or might call constraints. I think the average person would probably consider them community assets. So here's a historic structure right up against the roadway. A real challenge from a transportation perspective, but from a community perspective, something we really have to embrace and make sure we don't change as we make these improvements. And certainly, the importance of nature in this area can't be overstated. So this is a Santuit River running right under 28. I had never noticed it until I jumped off and really walked down there. It's a great asset, something we have to think about as we do our transportation planning. Once we go out and do the projects, we try to get out into the community, have meetings in this room and in other locations. We want to make sure we get the word out in any means that we can. We always want to make sure we gather input. It's really a challenge when you have that tractor out there plowing the road and someone objects to the project. It's too late at that point. So we try to get people involved early. And back in the office, this is the things that we're putting together. So the engineers are putting together the spreadsheets there. We're putting together the models. You see, I don't know, you've probably all seen these little cars driving around. It looks like a video game. It's useful, but maybe not most useful in public. So we always make sure we try to boil it down to something that seems a little more relatable. And we really want to get feedback, and the best way to get feedback is to present something that people can understand. And we do get feedback. So the good old sticky note activities is a tried and true method, but it's really a way for people to respond to it. So we make sure we get feedback from the community, and ultimately we want to see improvements. We want to see solutions to the challenges out there. So these are some examples of projects in the region that have been gone through the commission in some way, and really tried to get at some of the challenges in the area. You may notice I'm a roundabout fan, so we can have that debate later. If there's anyone on the other side, I'll try to win you over. And then up next, I'm sure what everyone in this room wants to hear about, the Mashpee Rotary. So each year the commission takes on one large planning study from the transportation perspective. So starting in the fall, we will be looking at the Mashpee Rotary. So I'm sure we'll have maybe back in this room, maybe you'll need a larger room, I'm not sure. But we're going to be tackling it in the same method. We're working on the data right now, and then we're going out to the community, so we're going to want to hear you. We'll certainly be partnering with Mashpee Commons and everyone in the area who has interest in this. We want to understand what's going on around the Rotary. You'll see, we'll mention that a little bit more, but just something to look out for. We will be looking for public input on that. We'll be coming up with short-term solutions in terms of signs and lines, is what we usually say in the industry. And then the big thing is you'll see some things that are crazy and some things that you might not like, but that's the whole point. We want to put it out there and we want to hear what the community has to say. So here's the exciting part for me. Steps beyond my engineer role, but what I'm really more excited about is what is the vision for the future. I think it's pretty obvious when you start to look at across the Cape and across the country. These transportation issues are not necessarily transportation issues. There's a real interplay between transportation and land use planning, and that's where we want to make sure when we're in areas where there's large community assets or large retail developments to really think of those together. So these are 3 locations on the Cape, one that's not on the Cape. Hope everyone in the room can pick out which one's not on the Cape. But what's interesting about these is, this one, for example, here, we were brought in because there's a transportation problem. We really looked at it more closely. It was a land use problem. So there was curb cuts all along it. There was no control. It was a mess. So really, we came up with some transportation solutions, but they're not going to work unless you work on the land use side as well and work on the adjacent land uses. So what we've been really doing at the commission is trying to bring those 2 areas together, really focus on what are the problems, and then holistically, what are the solutions, looking both on the land use side and the transportation planning side. At the highest level, at the regional level, that's the connection between our regional policy plan, which sets the overall vision for the region, and the regional transportation plan, which really allocates funding for those big transportation projects in the region. So you can really bring those 2 together, and to the point that really they share a vision at this point. Those of you who saw Christy Senator present this last, this is the same vision. This is a vision that's going to be brought forward in the regional policy plan for protecting the resources and focusing economic activity in the activity centers. But this is something that almost word for word appeared in the regional transportation plan a few years ago. We've recognized that really this is a key to trying to have sustainable growth in the region, is to protect those things that need protecting, and where we are going to be developing, make sure it's going in the right places. And one of those things we really want to focus on is activity centers. Places where there's community activity, places where there's business activity, and really a built environment that's conducive to that kind of growth. So these are the places that you would call places that you want to go to do things, to meet people. There's all sorts of activities. And what it really boils down to is there are places that people want to get to. So we want to try to intensify the development there. We've been trying to prioritize improvements in that area to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support it, but really build on some of the transportation features in these areas. But we don't just want to add development to activity centers. We want to do it in a reasonable way. We want to do it in a way that minimizes impacts on the regional and local transportation system. So we have to be very careful about the way we grow in these activity centers. It really comes down to 2 things in terms of minimizing impacts, and that's housing and transportation connections. So best way to get development without getting new impacts is putting the people where the place is. So then you're not driving there, you're not walking there, you're there. So if you can, in a very smart way, commingle that sort of development, you really don't have those impacts. You don't have additional traffic. You can walk across the street to the grocery store. So that's the first thing. We want to see more housing where we have these traditional activity centers and these growing activity centers. And then second, there's certainly going to be a consumer base further outside. So it's really about what sort of transportation connections are there. So we want to focus on areas that are transportation hubs, that have those connections, both vehicular as well as transit, non-motorist. We want people to get to these activity centers by a variety of means. So really focusing on areas that have that sort of infrastructure, that are already regional hubs, so that we're not spending an exorbitant sum of money to develop these areas, really building on what's out there today. So that's the regional perspective, diving into the local. And again, we'll be looking at the Mashpee Rotary in more detail, so you can certainly come and pack the house again for that call.
I love talking traffic. This is really my dream on a Tuesday night. As I mentioned, I'm Tom Feronti. I've been with Mashpee Commons for almost 15 years now. Really what we're here to talk about tonight is infrastructure and systems planning. And infrastructure and systems planning really is more than just traffic. So what is infrastructure? Infrastructure is traffic, which we just had a lot of wonderful information from Steve. It's parking, it's water and wastewater planning, it's connectivity. And a lot of these themes are themes that Steve touched on in his presentation. And it really is looking at it from a regional perspective and then as a local perspective here in the town of Mashpee and in Mashpee Commons. And infrastructure can often be thought of as an impediment. Traffic is bad, parking is tough, but it's not necessarily a reason not to grow. It's solvable solutions. Mashpee Commons was originally started in the early 60s as a strip center. The red area is the commercially zoned land in the town of Mashpee, and this is the Mashpee Commons part that we know right now. Mashpee Commons is located in the geographic center of town. It's in the certified growth center of town, and all that red is the commercial area. But what we're learning is that the commercial world is changing a little bit to the point where we need to try and bring residential into some of these areas. As Steve just mentioned, it's bringing the people to the areas. And one of the impediments that we run into is that residential development is not necessarily allowed in these areas. There is a way through an arduous and convoluted process to do it, but it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of what we're trying to do. Mashpee as a town has approximately 15,000 acres of land area. It's 17,000 plus or minus in total area. It's about 15,000 acres of land area. And this area of Mashpee Commons, which is the part that we talk about, is roughly 1.2% of the total land area of the town. So this is what we've built so far to date. Again, it started in the early 60s, the redevelopment began in 1986, and these are the three distinct neighborhoods that we've built up to this point in time. This is the existing conditions of Mashpee Commons. The larger circle is the Mashpee Commons piece that we all know about. It's the commercial center, there's residential development. The smaller piece just to the north is the North Market Street development where Stop and Shop is. It's more the service-oriented place, and then we just started our residential expansion to the south. So why we're all here tonight? To talk about traffic. Now I love this photo because we talk about traffic a lot on Cape Cod, and we talk about how bad traffic is on Cape Cod, and that the bad traffic is only recent. But this picture just kills me because it looks like it's from the 1970s, and it's the same issues that we're running into on the bridges now. It's traffic backups at the bridge. Same problem, different time. Again, traffic problems are solvable though. They're not reasons to stop. At Mashpee Commons, as Steve mentioned, we are at a crossroads. We are in an area that services regional traffic and it services local traffic. The regional traffic that's trying to use those main arteries, the 151 leg, the Route 28 leg, to go east and west on Cape Cod. The people that just want to get through Mashpee to go from Falmouth to Hyannis or Sandwich. We have the local traffic, the 14,000 residents in the town of Mashpee that are trying to get from South Mashpee to Town Hall, or they're trying to get to Bourne or Sandwich or Falmouth. And then we have the people that are actually trying to come to Mashpee Commons, whether they're outside of the Cape or they're Mashpee residents, wherever they're from, they're trying to come to Mashpee. So there's good traffic and there's bad traffic. if anybody has been to some of our other Tuesday talks, you've heard us mention that traffic is kind of like cholesterol. There's good traffic that you don't necessarily mind, and there's bad traffic that you really don't want to have at all. All Cape Cod towns have population spikes in the summer. We know that. We know that it brings traffic. We know that the road system in many areas of the Cape isn't designed to handle the traffic. But we have to figure out a way to fix what needs to be fixed and allow what should be allowed. So what is bad traffic and what is good traffic? Bad traffic is the traffic on the regional thoroughfares that really just grinds things to a halt. It causes backups. It leads to frustrations. It really prevents anyone from going anywhere. Good traffic is traffic that flows, but maybe at a little bit of a slower rate. It makes it a little bit safer for people to walk. It allows for walkability and connectivity. Tighter buildings, tighter streets. It makes it safer for pedestrians. Good traffic allows for connectivity. It allows for businesses to perhaps improve a little bit because they have more visibility with more people driving by at a slower speed. One of the things that we talk about, it's a little bit of a contrary viewpoint, but there's a theory that you have to slow down to speed up. And I think the Mashpee Rotary is sort of one of those classic examples. The rotaries, when designed properly, and Steve will help me on this one, rotaries when designed properly are really, really beneficial to traffic patterns. They allow for a constant, steady stream of traffic to flow. Experts tell us that they're more pedestrian friendly, but the Mashpee Rotary has its issues. There are 5 legs. Some of the entry points are too close to one another. The angle of entry is a little bit off on some of them, so you have more of a straight shot. It has a wide diameter, which encourages high speeds. And one of the things that we talk about is how do we look at the Mashpee Rotary and how do we account for the Mashpee Rotary when we balance that regional traffic and that local traffic to allow the Rotary to actually be a part of the traffic solution. And it certainly is a consideration when we look at all of our master planning efforts within Mashpee Commons. And if you look at 2014 data for traffic counts, the Rotary is failing. It's an E or an F depending on the day or the time of year. Not looking at the grades, but looking at the queues and the wait times, that's really what traffic engineers want to focus on, is how do we get people through the Rotary without waiting as much time? Again, it's slowing down to speed up. There have been lots of solutions proposed to fix the Rotary. There have been some that are a little bit outlandish, like building a tunnel underneath the Rotary. Shrinking the diameter, reducing the number of legs. But one of the ways that is possible to look at is, instead of ways to just fix the Rotary, how do we mitigate the number of cars that actually have to go through the Rotary? And back in the early 2000s, there was a Rotary charrette that was posted at the church. And one of the products of that charrette was really looking at creating a network of streets, so that instead of everyone having to go through the Rotary to get from one end of Mashpee to the other, we create a network of streets so that it allows people that are in the know to utilize different routes to get where they need to go. And it allows the regional traffic to get through the Rotary, and it allows the local traffic to get around the Rotary. Ultimately, it's going to take a multitude of suggestions to actually fix the Rotary. It's going to take input from a number of organizations. I was thrilled to hear that the Commission is taking on the Rotary as their next targeted project, and we're anxious to be part of that process. And as Steve mentioned, public transit is another way that it starts to mitigate that number of cars that have to go through the Rotary. The more connectivity that you have between neighborhoods, the more access that you have to public transit. We love finding pictures of buses that go through Mashpee Commons. We don't have a lot of pictures, but this is a great one because the bus actually stops right there a couple times a day. Picks up in the morning, stops a couple times during the afternoon, and in the afternoon, school kids get off the bus there. And because of the location of Mashpee Commons in the geographic center, it is a hub for multiple bus routes. My picture doesn't nearly do justice to what you showed up there, but this is the bus map, the trail map, the bus map, I'm sorry, not the trail, the bus map from Cape Cod Regional Transit Authority. And the star right in the middle, that's Mashpee Commons. That's where their red line and their blue line combine. And if there's 1 million riders that are riding the bus, then that's fantastic. We need to figure out how to improve the bus stops and how to improve the access to public transit so we can actually increase that number. And now my favorite topic is parking. And this quote just kills me because it's from almost 100 years ago, and it's very apropos to what we're dealing with now. Politics and parking are probably the two things that people are most concerned about, and it was 100 years ago as well. As I said, Mashpee Commons started in the early 60s as the new Savory Shopping Center. It was built to supplement the housing development in Mashpee, and it really was what we now refer to as a strip center. It was single-story structures, and there was lots of available parking. But before you all start throwing things at me, I would offer that we don't actually have a parking problem in Mashpee Commons. If you look at zoning regulations in the town, and parking is one of the more or the most regulated aspect of development, Mashpee Commons actually has an excess of spaces based on what we have built. And people are shaking their head, and it's the #1 complaint we get. But what we have at Mashpee Commons is a parking proximity problem, because people want to park in the on-street spaces. People want to park in the space right in front of the post office, right in front of the restaurant that they want to go to. And we understand that, because when you park in that street, you're parking in your town. It's your downtown. You're seeing your neighbor walking to the post office. You're seeing your friend that you haven't seen in a week at the coffee shop. And that's great. That's what we're trying to develop. But the reality is, we have a lot of parking that's only utilized 15 to 20 days out of the year. We build a lot of parking to satisfy the peak demand that happens the Fridays in the summertime and the week before Christmas. The on-street parking is full, but the parking is available. Realistically, those parking lots are available to use. It's just a little bit longer of a walk. Parking is, as I said, is very regulated. What we find at Mashpee Commons is that our streets are actually driveways, and part of the reason that they're not streets is because of the on-street parking. Even still, as the previous slide showed, the bulk of our parking is in surface spots that have frontage on roadways, and that's not actually how traditional urbanism worked. Traditional urbanism was the buildings fronting on the roads and the parking lots in the back, but this is what we're required to build. And one of the things that we notice when we look at parking versus the giant parking fields is that we don't want an inappropriate amount of parking. We don't want to build too little. We don't want insufficient parking. We don't want people to feel like they can't ever come here any day of the week, but we don't want to build too much parking. Parking is expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, and it provides vast expanses of impervious surfaces that really aren't that pleasant to walk through. Walking in the parking lots in Mashpee Commons, we have always tried to design those as pleasant experiences. So it might be a 5-minute walk from one side of Mashpee Commons to another, but you're walking through a pleasant environment. It might be the same distance that you're walking at a traditional mall where you're parking in a parking lot and you're walking to a store in the center of the mall. I would argue that what has been built at Mashpee Commons and what has been proposed for future projects is a more pleasant walking experience than doing that at a mall. And part of why we get into this infrastructure discussion is because the retail world is changing. When we look at infrastructure, we can't just propose the same infrastructure that has always been proposed in these projects. It's not building the same streets, it's not building the same sidewalks. And part of it is because the downtown is changing. It's really looking at the area between the buildings now and not what's within the buildings. It's really looking at building that complete neighborhood. And the unique quality of our independent retailers is really why we focus on this. We're trying to build that complete neighborhood to supplement what our retailers are already putting forth. And as we look at that, we look at things like outdoor entertainment, outdoor dining, games on the sidewalks. And anybody that's walked through Mashpee Commons in the summer is accustomed to hear the thud, thud, thud of the bean bags hitting the boards and on the sidewalks with all the merchants that put their stuff out there. And that's all part of the infrastructure planning. It's providing sidewalks that are large enough for those activities to take place. It's providing areas large enough for that outdoor dining while still allowing for the traffic to get through and the parking to happen and the people to walk by. Another aspect of infrastructure and systems planning is water quality, and really this is why we're all here. This is why Cape Cod is such a special place to so many people. It's because of the wonderful waterways that we have. This is the Papaneset Bay watershed and this was a subject of the Cape Cod Commission's 208 plan where they looked at the water quality program. This is what we're trying to protect. This is the Mashpee River feeding into Papaneset Bay. And Mashpee Commons has a wastewater treatment plant. And that wastewater treatment plant services the Mashpee Commons development as well as municipal buildings We'll eventually have the assisted living facility tied into it. And we've always been a willing partner with the town to really explore how these small package plants throughout the town can be part of the overall solution to the town to solve the wastewater issue. And the wastewater issue is nitrogen loading in our basin, and our estuaries. In the 208 report, looking at just the Papaneset Bay estuary, there were, I believe, 3 towns that feed into that. There's Mashpee, there's Barnstable, and there's Sandwich. And out of those 3 towns, 75% of the loading, of the nitrogen loading in that estuary comes from the town of Mashpee. 82% of that load is from septic tanks at single-family homes. 1% of that is from wastewater treatment plants around town. Part of the reason is that if you look at a septic tank for a single-family home, it averages somewhere in the neighborhood of 35 milligrams per liter of nitrogen into the watershed. The DEP threshold for a wastewater treatment plant is around 10 milligrams per liter. Our wastewater treatment plant at Mashpee Commons for the last 2 years has been 2.4 milligrams per liter and 2.1 milligrams per liter. So when you start looking at the amount of nitrogen that is being put in by a septic tank versus a wastewater treatment plant, you start to see that wastewater treatment plants can be part of that solution, and that single-family homes with septic systems are really what's causing the problem to begin with. Open space, which is what we talked about a little bit last week during the zoning discussion. We talked a lot about open space during our visioning meetings. But the question that we often come up with, what is open space? What are we trying to do with open space? And open space can mean many different things. It can mean conservation land. It can mean functional open space. We like to think that some open space means usable green space for the kids to play soccer and the people to bring their dogs for a walk and just to sit and have a nice picnic in the afternoon. The town of Mashpee has somewhere around, I don't know the exact number, but I think it's somewhere around 45% of the land is 40%. Mary says more, Tom says. Somewhere around 45% of the town. This is an old map, but somewhere around 45% in the town of Mashpee is conservation land, is open space land. But one of the things that Steve talked about that we're trying to figure out is how do you connect all that? If we have this open space that nobody can use and that nobody can access, then does it really benefit other than just being simply open space? So how do we figure out a way to make that more of a connected path trail system so that somebody can ride their bike from Main Street Mashpee to the beach? Right now, you can get bits and pieces here and there, but you can't get all the way through. If there was a connected trail system, similar to what the Mashpee Planning Board has been promoting for a couple of years now with their Greenways project, then it becomes more of a benefit for the town to have that connected path through the town. It's all about connecting. It's all about providing alternate forms of people to get from where they are to where they want to go. So with that, I will pass it off to Andrew, and at the end, we will have an opportunity for some questions.
I got no pictures. No canned presentation.
I'll do that.
What?
Yes,
Okay. So, in the introduction, you guys said I was here for APCC, right? Is that the hat I'm wearing?
Yes.
Okay. I got a bunch. So, for those who don't know, APCC, the Association of Preserve Cape Cod, the 50-year-old environmental advocacy and education organization that was started in response to the Army Corps of Engineers having the bright idea to dredge the Great Nauset Marsh, turn it into a deep water harbor. And a bunch of people got together to push back on that idea. The organization was born, and we've been out fighting the good fight on environmental advocacy and education on what we think to be all the important issues of the day on Cape Cod for the last 50 years. And so for us right now, in part because I think it's an important issue that the organization has some history in, and also in part because I'm there and it's kind of what I like to work on, we've been focusing a lot in the last year on water quality. And for Cape Cod, water quality has been largely defined as estuarine water quality health and the nitrogen loading problem. There are also issues, you know, there were issues around drinking water, obviously, that gave rise to Mashpee, to the Mashpee Water District, and there are certainly numerous issues around ponds. And they share a commonality around nutrients. We have a nutrient management problem on Cape Cod, driven largely by the fact that we pretty much deal with most of our waste the way people did when they arrived here in the 1600s. Dig a hole and throw it in the ground, and you kind of hope the ground takes care of it. And you know, the resilience of our resources is evidenced by the fact that it took until the 1990s for the cumulative insult that's been imposed on the water resources of Cape Cod to begin to manifest themselves in a way that people began to pay attention. That you couldn't just look at the pretty blue sky reflecting off the water and say, isn't that lovely? Everything's fine here. And when we started to lose our resident shellfish populations, we lost our resident eelgrass populations. There are the loss of the sandy substrate bottom that people, old-timers, would associate with our streams and estuaries, where you could walk on the bottom and feel good in your feet, as opposed to now you're walking on the bottom and you're walking through 6, 8, 10, 12 inches of, you know, soupy mayonnaise, of poorly degraded organic matter that's sucking all the oxygen out of the water and resulting in poor aquatic habitat and fish kills. So we are where we are now, and you know, we've known, generally speaking, since the late 80s, early 90s, that we had taken poor stewardship care of our water resources, and we had a wastewater problem. Now, why hasn't Cape Cod dealt with it? You know, Tom put up some statistics. You know, we are atypical in a number of different ways to the rest of Massachusetts. The vast majority of our septic waste is our human waste is dealt with through septic systems. You said 1% of the flow in Mashpee. About 3% of the parcels on Cape Cod are serviced by publicly owned treatment works. You know, most other places in Massachusetts, north of the bridge and west of the Berkshires, they're all primarily on sewage treatment facilities. They have their own issues, but they do result in significant reductions in nutrient loading. The Cape has chosen almost at every turn to reject large infrastructure as it relates to wastewater. We bit the bullet and did it on the water supply side because people perceived a threat to public health that they don't perceive on the wastewater issue, and the issues are somewhat different. So the few times that we've looked at the issue, Cape has turned its back on it. Why? Because it costs a lot of money. If you look at the history of the issue in towns over the years that have said no, if you look at what they said no to and that cost, you jump at it in a minute right now. So it's always too expensive. However, certain things happened during the course of our sitting this one out that have made it hard. The federal government in the Reagan era walked away from federal grants for wastewater. So it used to be build a wastewater treatment plant, sewers are connected, 90% federal money, 10% match. Most Cape towns, Mashpee wasn't thinking about it at the time, but Barnstable, Yarmouth, Falmouth, Chatham, Orleans, looked at it in the 60s, 70s, 80s, turned down 90-10 money. That was replaced with a system of loans. There's a federally seeded state revolving loan fund that provides an ongoing source of low or no interest wastewater financing to towns. But instead of getting 90% of it as a grant, you're paying back the principal plus some incremental interest. It's less than the market interest, and because of some legislation that passed in 2009, I want to say, there's a zero interest provision that applies to Cape towns doing nutrient management projects. So the Cape has the available access to the cheapest money for wastewater infrastructure in the Commonwealth. Nobody else gets access to 0% loan financing other than the Cape and a few other communities that are doing nutrient management projects primarily. That said, most towns that step forward and say they want to do something on their wastewater have by and large gotten smacked down by their town meetings. Why? Because it's really expensive. Why is it so expensive? It's so expensive because unlike communities in metropolitan Boston or North Shore and the Blackstone Valley, who are repairing and upgrading existing facilities that have aged out. They were built using that 90-10 money back in the 70s and 80s. They're now 40 years old. So they all need rehabilitation and upgrading. But it's a lot cheaper to upgrade the existing facility and the associated collection systems than it is to start fresh. So on the Cape, we're starting fresh. And as a general rule, the way we developed as a community, broadly, not just Mashpee, has increased the cost of sewer. Why? Because large lot subdivisions with big distances between connections along a sewer pipe are more expensive per home to build than ones that are serving areas that are densely concentrated. You're hooking up fewer people within a given area, the cost per unit goes up. And so when I was with the county and working with the folks at the commission, we were looking at this from the perspective, across the board. We came up with an approach that said, let's sort of back into the numbers and say that for the purposes of what's affordable in Massachusetts, the standard is generally held to be no more than what the metropolitan area of Boston is paying for water and sewer through the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, which is about $1,200 a year per family, rough numbers. So if you took the overall cost of a reduced wastewater management program that no longer relied solely on infrastructure, but worked in alternative systems, some of the alternative septic systems that have some benefit in reducing nitrogen, large-scale aquaculture that's taken root in Mashpee, Falmouth, Wellfleet, and a few other communities. So modified environmental systems, inlet widening, perhaps some selected dredging, wetlands restoration. You put all that stuff together, and you brought the overall cost of dealing with the wastewater problem in the Cape from $8 billion to $4 billion. Okay? At $4 billion across the region, if you applied that $1,200 threshold, the rate base on Cape Cod can handle about half that. And so the plan that the commission and the county adopted says basically half of it borne locally, the other half by other sources. The other sources are 25% federal, 25% state, without any detailed or identification of what those additional sources might be. So even at that reduced level, brought the price down by half, and then are only paying locally for half, it's still a really expensive undertaking. And there's a lot of resistance to it. So different towns are taking different approaches to it. One other thing I will mention that we at PCC made our highest legislative priority this year was taking one of the recommendations that was in the 208 plan, which was to create a capital infrastructure bank for Cape Cod, and tweaked it a little bit around the idea of a water protection fund. That idea and that structure was adopted by both the House and Senate in separate pieces of legislation over the last 3 weeks, and is going to a conference committee to iron out the differences, and is likely to land on the governor's desk sometime before the 31st of July. That mechanism will provide the place where that 25% state money can go, and also has a funding stream associated with it, associated with the short-term rentals of homes and an expansion of the existing hotel-motel tax. There's a lot of differences and nuance between the way the House approached it, the Senate approached it, and I could bore you to death by talking to you about the different classifications of hosts and the differential tax rates that apply to the host and how that funds the trust, but I won't do that. But it provides, on the House side, about a quarter of the money that fills the state share. On the Senate side, it provides about half. So if the Senate version prevails, in one fell swoop over the course of a year, we will have established a long-term funding stream that provides somewhere in the order of $500 million over the planning period of the 208 plan. So it's a big step up, and what it'll end up doing is helping towns by allowing them to get the zero interest loan, so they'd be paying no interest on the loan. They would be no longer responsible for the entirety of the principal, some portion of it, depending on how much the trust fund is funded, would go down. So if you got a $100 million loan and this principal forgiveness piece happens, which I think it will, you might only have, in the best of all worlds, pay back 75 million of the 100 million and not pay any interest, which in today's world is a pretty good deal. So that has moved through, and that I think is going to help towns get their mind around the wastewater problem a little bit more. The other thing that I think people should think about a little bit is one of the ways that the county approach saved the region half the cost was to go into a watershed-based approach. That a lot of the savings that come from in this plan are reflected in the fact that the town entity is the wrong unit to manage your wastewater around. As Tom mentioned, Mashpee is 75% of Papaneset flow. Well, where's the other 25% come from? Well, it comes from Sandwich and Barnstable. And in the instance of that particular water body, we need the active participation in Mashpee of those two towns controlling their load so that the improvements that we're going to hope to see by doing the things we want to do within Mashpee are going to be realized. And at the same time, there's the opportunity to do things with those towns jointly that will result in a more efficient and effective way to reduce nitrogen, where one town might be doing more than it would otherwise be doing, and some of that's funded by the adjoining town. So Mashpee, Sandwich, and Barnstable have an intermunicipal agreement around the Papaneset watershed that obligates us in some form to each other to move forward. That process needs to replicate itself elsewhere across the Cape. It needs to happen between us and Falmouth and Sandwich on the Coit side, and it needs to happen in the other, Aaron, how many we got? 40 something shared watersheds?
Oh, 32.
32. So there's an opportunity for 32 separate intermunicipal agreements that would create the place where that can happen. The state permitting process has been changed to allow for a mechanism that allows towns to come in and get a watershed permit and get a permit that allows you to do some of these things over a long period of time to insulate you from litigation, but also to give you administrative credit for the savings that come from something other than a treatment plant. So there's a lot of motion happening at the state level that is facilitating wastewater management in the towns. But at the end of the day, you know, it flows downhill, and it flows down to us at the individual town. And I will say, I'll switch hats a little bit, towns have a really, really hard time getting their mind around this. Most towns have a plan. Most towns don't embrace their plans. Why? Because they're really complicated, they're really expensive, they're time consuming. And if you implement it, you get the benefit of living through a major construction project where you're ripping up the streets during the time of year when people are here, and they get pissed off at you. And so we don't, I'll say this from a Mashpee Selectman point of view, we don't own our plan very well. We have a pretty good plan. Tom did a good job, the group that worked with him did a good job on it. We have a sort of grand vision of how we're going to get there. How we're going to get there, I don't know. I don't know because my board doesn't know. Because for the most part, they are like the other 14 boards of selectmen and councilors on Cape Cod. They just have a really hard time getting their minds around how they're going to finance not tens of millions of dollars, but hundreds of millions of dollars around the limits that they have. And so I think our role, jumping back in the ABCC role, is to try to unlock some of the barriers that get in the way of towns moving forward with it. Money's the biggest one. We sort of chip away at some of those issues. Money's the first and foremost. But also showing how some of these intermunicipal agreements, how some of these new permitting approaches are in the town's best interest. I will say that as an organization, our perspective is that thinking through developing differently is part of the equation. A continuation of new development that looks a lot like what we have done as a region is going to continue to increase the cost of solving this problem, because it's an expensive way to manage. So there is some benefit from a wastewater management perspective to concentrate development, collect some of that wastewater, treat it, and discharge it in the right place. And the right place is subjective as hell, and the right place doesn't always exist in an affordable way in every particular location. So it still comes back to your individual circumstance. But the role of development is different, I think, than perhaps it had been cast over the years as it relates to the wastewater thing. The caution I will throw out to all of this is that the existing wastewater plans and the 208 plan assumed and assessed a cost around what managing the existing load today, actually sometime in the past, needed to be in order to achieve the water quality goal, and that development above and beyond that in certain cases needed to be controlled at a level higher than what would historically been done. So whether it's a no net nitrogen limit or whether it's a way to offset, there is a hazard of putting a lot of money into solving the existing level of nitrogen enrichment and then allowing additional growth that isn't managed in the right way, put you sort of back down the road in the wrong direction. So we tend to look at development of the type you're talking about as potentially part of the solution. But if you're not careful, it could be something that exacerbates the problem. At the end of the day, there is a carrying capacity that these resources tell us above which they don't function well. And so, if you want additional load or additional flow, you're going to have to manage the load more carefully and at a higher level. And that is simply a matter of money. So, this issue, as it comes up in Mashpee Commons, as it comes up in Mashpee, as it comes up everywhere else across the Cape, is I think one of the more defining ones we're going to deal with. Because at the end of the day, people come to the Cape for a lot of reasons, but if the water quality isn't there, they ain't coming. And not only are they not coming, a lot of the embedded investment that you have, you don't have to be a developer and you don't have to be a commercial operator to have value embedded in your real estate. And for those of us that just own a home, our homes are the biggest thing, environmental or economic asset we have. And a lot of that value comes from perception, what used to be the reality, what continues to be the perception, that water quality on Cape Cod is good and supports a multitude of uses. And so we risk that at our own peril because it potentially undermines everything that as individuals you might want to have for your own retirement or whatever purpose of passing on, as well as the larger commercial operators. So with that, I'll stop.
All right. Let me invite the three speakers up to the front so we can grill you all on infrastructure now. So I was trying to take notes on a number of the talks, but I think the overall theme was where do you find the money when you look at these infrastructure moves? And I think looking at sort of the proximity of Mashpee Commons and the issues here in town, I think there's a short-term as well as a long-term solution there. So I think, that I was kind of sort of looking back at that sidewalk you showed on the slide and thinking about how that seems like such a simple move. But the reality is, what's the cost of a street in Cape Cod right now? And what's the cost of a sidewalk? What are those dollars and cents so people get an idea of what stuff costs? Because I think that's related to this whole thing, is what's really behind how we implement some of these changes. I think Andrew's talk just sort of peeled back some of the layers around the wastewater issues, but I think there's similar complexity to all of these elements of the building environment.
So great question. Certainly some of the things we're talking about here are big dollar amounts and are big challenges to fund, but there are some of these smaller projects that can be funded, these sidewalk connections that are really important. So I think we have an advantage over wastewater in that we actually have some really significant dedicated funding streams. Most of the projects you see out here are funded 80% federal, 20% state, and usually the town is designing them, which is about it. So we have some money there. But along with those large sums of money come a lot of design requirements. So as I mentioned, that 151 Mashpee project is approaching $13 million. So that was a big project. That's 10 years in the making. So when you identify these challenges, it's tough to try to sell it to a community to say, we have a solution, you'll have it 10 years from now. So fortunately, there's been some recent activity from the state and from some of the towns that are trying to get some of those smaller cost items taken care of. So a lot of the towns are in the process of looking for money at the state level in what's called the Complete Streets Program, which is a very innovative program from the state, in that the towns get to identify which connections are important to them, and then they get a funding stream, $400,000, to try to tackle those small pieces, which the town can do quite a bit in terms of small sidewalk jobs. It depends whether or not there's takings involved, but you can get sidewalks on the order of $100 a foot in terms of sidewalks, and you're going to multiply that times 5 or more if you're talking about a state project. So the towns have been good at trying to identify some of the towns have been good at trying to identify some of those small projects to make those important connections. So we, the county, have been trying to help towns identify regionally which are those most important ones, and try to really get those low-cost, high-benefit projects out the door first, and continue planning for something like the Mashpee Library. It's going to be a much bigger build down the road.
I think an important follow-up to that is, when Steve and Andrew talk about these funding sources, they're talking about the first cost, the cost to just build it. That's not the cost to maintain it. That's not the 40-year-old wastewater treatment plant that you've got to come up with some source of funding somewhere to actually repair that plant and rebuild that plant. So it's the same way with roads. Roads and sidewalks have a shelf life. So there might be that initial funding source, but there has to be a way to put aside a reserve fund somewhere so that when the time comes for that road to be repaved, there's actually a source of funding there for that as well.
Certainly maintenance is a big challenge for all communities.
Do we open up questions?
Yeah, no, I think one more clarifying question. Just go ahead and put the hands up. Okay, I'll come to you right. So Tom mentioned the kind of performance metrics around traffic intersections and grading. Just for everyone's sort of collective knowledge, what does that mean to have an intersection perform at an F? Because
I think it's bad.
well, I want to make sure everyone kind of reorients their brains. I've seen a lot of communities around New England saying we have only so much land. We can't just keep adding lanes. That's sort of not the solution to traffic congestion. And then again, we don't want to destroy our character of our roads and our streets. So where does that extra capacity go to? And they're looking at sort of transportation management plans to try and offset like peak hour demand and such, but also look at mode shift. So they're trying to take a certain percentage of people out of their cars and into some other mode. And I think that's because the traffic engineering world is starting to think about how to measure these places around context, which I think.
What's your shot?
Oh, I'm sorry. Around context, like what? So when we say it performs as an F, some intersections are actually better if they perform as an F versus other intersections performing as an S. So how can you explain that a little bit more for everyone?
Certainly, and even when I was in school just less than 10 years ago, they already told me never say level of service in public, never talk about grades A through F in public, because you have that inherent assumption that A is always the target and F is always bad, and that's simply not true. You wouldn't want to see level of service A in most communities around here. You'd see cars flying by, you wouldn't get to enjoy the Cape the way it is. On the other side of it, there are roads that are okay to have level of service F. Something like a main street in Falmouth probably operates at level of service F, but you would kind of want to see that. You want those slow speeds for people to be able to walk. You want motorists to feel safe. So in certain contexts, level of service is something that really can be a discussion and a trade-off. So I think it really is important to know the context of the road you're operating in. Level of service, in the simplest sense, is just how many extra seconds it takes you to get down the road. But maybe in a certain spot, that's not the most important thing. Just because it takes you 3 more seconds to get down Main Street in Falmouth, I don't think that's important. I think it's more important that someone can safely cross the street. So in all our projects, we make sure we show the trade-offs amongst the things. You may get a little more delay, but maybe it's more walkable. So it's really a balance.
So, gentleman in the red sweater, you have a question, then we'll come back to.
Yeah, thank you. I'm kind of intrigued by the transportation part of the presentation tonight, and I'm sitting here thinking, we wouldn't be here tonight, and these forums wouldn't be taking place if the master plan for Mashpee Commons was not in somewhat of a stage of flux, let's say. And then, as you point out, the commission is just now beginning to undertake the Mashpee Rotary debacle. And then we have this already approved $16 million project to make improvements along Route 151. And then the state, unilaterally it seems, is undertaking this roundabout at Newtown Road and another means of access to Route 130 off of 28, which seems to me to have a lot of bearing on what's going on at the Rotary in Mashpee Commons and vice versa. So we have these major projects either beginning or just beginning in the planning and talking stages that are all going to have an impact right where we are tonight. Not only for us and in Mashpee, as you point out, but surrounding towns and so forth. How does all this get reconciled? Is the cart before the horse? Who's in charge? Is it all going to connect in the way that makes the most financial and pragmatic sense for the people that have to use the result?
So a whole bunch of questions there. I'll end with the very end of it though. I certainly think that is the goal, to make sure that everyone's working together on the same page, trying to do what's the most cost effective and what's best for the community. This is going to be a big effort looking at the Mashpee River in the fall. This is not the first time we've looked at this intersection. This is not the first time the state, the town. There's been many iterations looking at the Mashpee River, and certainly any time the commission has reviewed a development proposal, whether it be Mashpee Commons or anyone else, we always look at these major infrastructure challenges and very carefully look at how any new development would impact those assets. So that's the first thing. This isn't the first time we're looking at the Mashpee Road, we're just taking another look at it. I think that I could probably spend my career looking at certain locations on the Cape, whether it be the canal or the Hyannis Rotary. Some of these things keep coming back up. So I would say this is the latest look at the Mashpee Rotary. And this time, hopefully, with some of the other activities going on at the same time, I hope we can head together in a direction for some solutions. So I think it's a good opportunity where we're looking at changes in the land use surrounding Mashpee Rotary. We're looking at some improvements in the area. I think it was a great time to take another look at it, given the context of what's going on around it, to take a deep dive into what's going on at the Mashpee Rotary.
So we'll go to this gentleman and then back to you, Miss. Do you want to go?
Sure.
Yeah, then we'll come to you.
On the transportation question, it seems like there's one element that hasn't come up this evening, and maybe it's because it's way off in the future, which I say somewhat facetiously. Automated transportation. Nobody has talked about, and I don't necessarily mean automobiles that are driverless, but I do mean transportation vehicles that might be automated. I was looking at your presentation about parking lots, and I'm thinking about Disneyland, and I'm thinking about people movers, and I'm saying, gee, it seems to me, and I realize that part of Disneyland's solution included horses and carriages, but keeping that concept in mind, just in an area like Mashpee Commons, again, I can hear all the obstacles, but isn't that something that should be in the mix? I haven't heard anybody talk about that, both at the Commons and throughout the Cape.
Regional side first? Sure. So certainly from the regional perspective, autonomous vehicles and other emerging technologies, including emerging trends such as ride-hailing services, are something that we are looking at. It was incorporated in our last regional transportation plan because it really will change the landscape of transportation. But what it really means in the short term for us is there's certain investments that are going to be important no matter what happens with that development. Focusing on pedestrian improvements, other non-motorist improvements, transit improvements, those are important no matter what. When we're talking about the big $100 million investments that increase capacity, that's when we really have to think about if things are going to change, whether we want to build big. Although I'll say I don't see anything building that big on Cape Cod. I think gone are the days we're going to build our way out of it, so we're certainly trying to focus on the things that are going to be important no matter the technology involved.
And I think from a local standpoint, if you're talking about just sort of traversing your way around Mashpee Commons, one of the things that has come up in some of our visioning sessions is how to make the farther parking lots, the ones that are more remote, how do we make that more enticing for people to park at? And we've started talking about other solutions for ways to bring access to them, and maybe autonomous vehicles are a way to do that. We had a Tesla dealership in Mashpee Commons for a little while. We have electric vehicle charging stations here. As we all know, Tesla is moving in that direction where the cars are driverless in some instances. And so the technology is there, the infrastructure is there within Mashpee Commons to have it. It's just the mode has to get there to meet up with everything.
It just seems like it should be part of the planning, and I respect the fact that these vehicles still run on road systems. But one of the things that we keep trying to solve and I know we're gonna have to replace bridges, but then it becomes a question of how big are the highways. And I'm saying, at some point, you can accommodate the same amount of traffic if you had a more efficient automated system to move people around. I don't really care how I get from Sandwich to Mashpee if I can do it in roughly the same amount of time with no more hassle and hopefully less hassle and less cost. So I'm just challenging everybody to think about the broad picture.
I've heard that this question has been asked a number of times recently, and I would, if you're interested in this, even the experts don't know what's going on with autonomous vehicles yet. I've talked to Uber and Nissan and a few other car manufacturers, and they're all trying to keep up. But I think if you want to hear about how this might intersect with the planning of a place, you could Google Jeff Speck. He's a exceptional urban planner. Autonomous Jeff Speck, S-P-E-C-K. He has a great TED talk on this whole issue. So I think it's something a lot of people are thinking about, but no one has the right solution. I think we come back to what happened 100, 500, 1,000 years ago and how we organize cities and villages and towns and neighborhoods might be a good pattern to replicate and let the transportation technology connect up where it needs to. So that's kind of the emerging dialogue that I've been hearing a lot. But I think this gets to sort of a larger question of how we see the convenience of transportation weaving into the comments. So I know you've been patient.
Yeah. Hi. This is in regard mostly to wastewater. Since 85%, I think is what you said, of a lot of the nitrogen loading is due to individual septic, which is mostly what the Cape has there been any advances in technology that would help within, like, I'm going to say this, like within actually toilets or on a local level so that residents, I know the 208 plan is part of that, but it's like, has there been anything else that we could implement with everybody that has a septic system? Could we do that on a home by home basis? Is there any way?
Not really.
Not really.
There are a number of alternative septic systems that reduce nitrogen to some extent under certain circumstances. So in the aggregate, I think there are about 1,500 nitrogen reducing systems in the Cape. They bring down the nitrogen level from about 45 to 19, 60% of the time. And some of that time variability comes from the fact that they're not that great in seasonal applications. Because it takes a long time for the system basically to heat up. So by the time it gets rolling and is working well, you're partway through the summer season, and then people leave and the biomass dies, and then you're getting basically, not all that much. So in the right places, they have a role. There's some promising technology that's being tested at the base now, the Septic Test Center run by the county, that is looking at a different type of system that uses a carbon feature in the leach field that binds nitrogen. It's promising, but it's not yet been quantified both in terms of the long-term nitrogen-reducing element to it, as well as just how long it's going to function appropriately. So that's, there's nothing you do, nothing you put down your toilet, nothing you do in terms of changing your practice within the house for the nitrogen issue is going to do very much. So, the best you can do is, wait and see what comes out with that. But if someone tries to sell you a system that's going to solve your problem, it's probably not something you want to own. And the reality, and one of the confounding problems with this from a public policy perspective is because each individual homeowner is part of the pollution source. No one person either has the means to make a meaningful difference in the environmental quality by doing something different with their waste. And there is no technological solution that allows you to comply. So, the individual is in a really tough spot because unlike something on the other side of the faucet, like water conservation, you have a drought, you can change your water use habits and make some sort of meaningful difference. Even with reduced use of water during a drought, you're still putting, your septic tank's still putting out the same general concentration of nitrogen out of the effluent that leaches into the ground. So it doesn't, you're very limited in being a part of the solution, which is why the towns are the scale at which this thing has to get solved, because the individual doesn't have the techniques available to them.
I wasn't thinking about it as an individual solution, I'm thinking about it as a way to, for everyone, you know, for
There are a lot of people, you know, there's a lot of vendors out there that are saying that their system is the answer. And the process by which you get state approval to sell an alternative septic system out in the general market is a very cumbersome, time-consuming, expensive process. The vendors will tell you that it stifles innovation. The perspective I had on it, and I'll plead out to the fact that I did work for the State Environmental Agency for 16 years, is that it served largely as a consumer protection function. That the arduous process by which septic systems have to go through that testing process, more often than not, it was found that the vendor claims early in the process were not borne out by performance. So rather than spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 on a mounted system in your backyard and make no appreciable difference, and then be asked to pay again by the municipality to participate in the public option, was really an untenable solution.
I'd like to follow up on that with some information. When we did the nitrogen management plan for the town, one of the scenarios that we ran specifically was, what if every single house in the watershed, national stand responsible for proper master tag, was put on one of these, you know, find septic systems that were separate from the 19 believe it. And you were correct about our plan is designed to build out, and what we knew about build out at the time. And the numbers on that were from 2001 version, but when we did that run with build out and using those P-night septic systems, the amount of nitrogen actually increased in the watershed because of the growth. So they're definitely not the solution.
Right. If any, the caution I would give, if anybody comes to you and says, the solution is this, they're more an advocate than a problem solver. Because what we've seen in town after town after town is that the only single technology that's a solution for the water quality problem would be sewering, all of it, and it's exorbitantly expensive. The rest of it leaves some residual nitrogen in the system. As Tom said, you know, as a rough notion, think that Papaneset Bay can take about 3 milligrams per liter of nitrogen in the groundwater, right? The best performing IA systems right now give you 19. A plain old Title 5 system gives you 45. So, you know, and even their system at 2.5, you know, is right on the cusp of, if that were everything that the water body is receiving, it would be healthy, but right on the margins. So it's a very difficult set of scenarios you have to work with.
Bob, and then we'll come to you.
I just want to ask Andrew something that a year ago or 18 months ago, when we first began to talk with the Cape Cod Commission, they were interested in what our plans were, because they thought if we could provide more housing and more density within our own property, that would, and that the effluent from that housing could be treated. In other words, to push development towards Mashpee Commons or on other towns to town centers, the so-called activity center. That was part of it. That strategy, as I understand it, was adopted because to try and solve this problem that you were bringing up tonight. In addition, along the way, there were two other things that have come up. One is the fiscal health of the town, i.e. that the tax base needs to have a strategy around it to increase in order to cover costs. And then secondarily, the housing problem, just generally the lack of housing for certain segments of the population. So I just wanted to comment all three of those things. If you think they're real problems, if you think that the type of activity that we're proposing here solves them somewhat, a lot, not at all, etc.
You know, I think, you know, I'll reiterate what I said. I think, you know, if we have a lot more individual, single-family development of the sort we've seen, I think my own view, and I'm not speaking for the commission on this one, is that it probably exacerbates some of the difficult social trends that we're seeing, social and environmental trends that we see on Cape Cod. I think it's an expensive way to develop, it adds to traffic flow, it raises the cost of wastewater management, and it produces a housing stock that's not particularly either affordable or responsive to the young and aging ends of the spectrum. So, and I think that some of the, you know, you're correct in saying that some of the interest, I think, that came out of the commission's planning in looking at growth centers has some of its origins in the lower cost per connection around wastewater, that's where you're going to do it. If you're going to build infrastructure anyway, it makes sense to put your development pressure there, take advantage of and lower the cost per unit of that infrastructure, whether it's roads, sidewalks, transportation, parking, or wastewater. You know, and as a general rule, I probably get that idea. The devil's in the details in terms of, you know, that's great as long as you're moving that density from someplace else to that location and it's not completely additive. And, you know, I think the track record of doing that in Massachusetts in general and our zoning laws isn't great. So I remain interested in what the method's going to be to make that work. The issue about finance, you know, you and I have been having this conversation in one form or another since the 80s. Been a skeptic. I'm less skeptical now than I was, but I will continue to feel that under the Massachusetts property tax structure, by and large, growth is a loser.
What is?
Growth is a loser for most Massachusetts communities. It's a necessary loser because it provides you a little bit of wiggle room within your year-to-year collections above the constraints of your 2.5% increase. But over the long haul, it still strikes me that it builds demands into community services that the communities don't have any institutional way to finance without going back to their voters and asking for more. So when we started this discussion, you know, back in the 80s, you know, we were, I don't know, I'm going to say our town budget was $18 million. We had no water system. We had no wastewater infrastructure. We had, you know, no schools, no high school of our own. We had a much smaller fire department, we had a much smaller police department. We had more open space, less of it in public ownership. We now have a $56 million budget. That tax rate has, those individual property tax bills have grown at a rate that probably exceeds inflation over that period of time. We have our own school system. We have all those public facilities that we didn't have with the exception of some sort of wastewater treatment. We have a lot of the same problems, and we have a objectively poor water quality result. We could have a long debate about whether as a community, there are certain aspects of Mashpee that are better off, and it's a different kind of community than it was. It has saved a lot of its essential character through the hard work of a lot of people, many of whom are in this room tonight. It has also given up some things. And so I'm still waiting to see that great example of the community that figured out how to grow in the right way that gives it an ever-growing revenue stream that lets it stay a little bit ahead of the sheriff when it comes time to pay the bills.
You weren't here the night that Joe Minicuzzi talked about this very same subject, but I think it's online, so it's available to see, dealing with this issue, which I think was really, I think maybe the commission is inviting him back or something to look at Mashpee Commons, Barnstable County or whatever. But this idea, to your point about what is the fiscal strategy that is the most optimum in this time with, you know, the existing conditions
And then, you know,
on health.
there are very few people in a given community that understand the mechanics of how municipal finance work, including a lot of the people in charge of it. And, you know, as a result, there's, you know, you're asking people who are not formally trained in any of these issues to make policy decisions about what type of change they want to see in their community without very much understanding of what the mechanisms they're setting forth and turning loose are going to produce in terms of economic burden or benefit to the residents of their community. And so we all do the best we can with the information we have and our own personal predispositions. And you're left with a series of problems. You know, if you did something else, you'd have a similar, somewhat different set of problems. So, you know, it's all, you know, there's 351 of these experiments going on at any given time in Massachusetts. And I don't know that anybody's completely figured it out. You look at the city of Boston a couple of years ago. They had $90 million in new growth revenue. That was additional tax revenue that was not within the 2.5 cap limit. And they still got cut school spending. We don't have anything like that. And we don't have a pathway of how to fund our long-term pension liabilities. We don't have a financing program for our wastewater. We are nibbling around the edges at the schools. We're doing okay by most of our measures of our neighbors. I wouldn't trade our position, maybe with Chatham, but there's nobody else on Cape Cod I'd trade our financial position with. But we struggle. Is what you're talking about part of the solution? Probably.
No.
It'll also contribute to some of the problems. I can't tell you right now when I sit here how that all nets out, but it's worth having a conversation.
Can I add something on the whole concept of continuing to do large lot zoning? That's impossible at Mashpee because Mashpee is totally built out, other than what's continuing to be built in New Seagrave, which is all sewer, and Southport. If you look at the building permits, they're all New Seagrave or Southport, basically, with a scattered vacant lot here and there in old subdivision. So that can't happen in Mashpee. So there is no growth left in Mashpee, other than what the Mashpee Commons owns. So that's a good thing.
Right. But there is infill. There's infill, and I would say the other thing we haven't talked about at all is conversion of use. You know, that things go from seasonal to more year-round.
Has that happened to us in the 90s?
That's happened, and it continues to happen, and it has significant impacts in extending the traffic period. It has significant impacts on nitrogen loading. It has meaningful impacts on overall water use. It may not hit your schools, and it may not hit some of your basic town services, but it does hit a lot of things, and it's a subtle change over which none of us have any control. Somebody who owns a home, they certainly have their liberty to use it for whatever period of time that they want over the course of the year. But I don't know, the multiplier on the Cape used to be 3-to-1 seasonal year-round population, summer population, and now it's closer to 2-to-1. Well, why is that? Well, because
So, this is an interesting comment, because Tom, and then I want to get back to your questions from the blue shirt, but just to pick up on this, the treatment plant in Mashpee is planned for capacity at peak flow, which is like the middle of July, right?
Well, it's the Mashpee Commons wastewater treatment plant is planned for eventual expansion. So we have to.
But how it operates
over
the course of the season.
Yeah, I mean, the Title V capacity of the plant is roughly double what the actual flows in the plant are, but it is sufficient to meet the summertime demand. But and that's the big issue with sewer. You know, you're designing your system for peak flow, which happens
4 weeks.
Yeah.
You build everything for, you know, middle of July to middle of August, and it doubles the cost of wastewater infrastructure, and then you're, you know, saddling that on the backs of the year-round population that's ill-suited to deal with it economically.
Sir?
Two questions. One is kind of sarcastic. The second is traffic. So everyone should come to Mashpee Commons and go to the bathroom there. And
I'll say it
fast.
and secondly, this is a purely Mashpee Commons problem, but you know, delivery trucks Mashpee Commons, few neighbors and even the UPS trucks come parking in the middle of the road. And you have a centralized delivery center and then have the stores come and pick up the boxes.
But you know, the interesting thing about that is that it has come up before about loading zones. And we do have some targeted loading zones throughout the commons. And we actually get more complaints from the people around those loading zones than we do when trucks park on the street to make their deliveries. We encourage our tenants to have deliveries done before Mashpee Commons gets busy. It's not a perfect world. It doesn't always happen, but it is something that we try and get our merchants to understand, that it doesn't benefit anyone to have the 18-wheeler parked on Steeple Street at 12:30 in the afternoon in July. So it is something that we work on, but I don't know that a centralized location is necessarily the right answer for that as well. I think finding specific locations for it is certainly part of the solution, but not the only solution.
You also got people parking in the loading zones, which can be a problem for guys trying to load.
Sure. So just a clarifying question first to make it easy. You're talking about the improvement plan for 151. That is the intention to build the hybrid bike path sidewalk from the old Barnstable Light, where the sidewalk currently ends, down to Falmouth Town line. Is that correct? I want to make sure that I understand that. Oh, okay. I want to make sure I understand that scenario. This is sort of a multi-pointed question, so forgive me if I ramble for a moment. Hilariously, I was one of the houses you lit up when you said, these are where the people live, this is how they get there. I live in Washington Valley Estates. I am literally directly behind the police and fire station. I could have walked here, but I have to go pick up my wife when I'm done. So I drove my car. I walk to the Commons frequently. In the summer, I even walk to the Commons. In the wintertime. But a lot of people aren't aware of these interconnections. And there is so little outreach as to what the capabilities are, what the functions are, and this goes also for wastewater treatment. You know, there is very little outreach from a governmental perspective, at least in my perception, that hello, alarm bells. There are very loud noises that bad things are happening. I'm a lifelong Cape Cod resident. I was born and raised in Orleans. My wife and I own a house in Mashpee. I live here. My wife is opening a center for autism for children with disabilities here in Mashpee. I work in Hyannis. I am not going anywhere. I'm stuck here. For lovingly lack of a better term. But we do not communicate in any way effectively about the needs or the significant problems that we face. OpenCable, fiber optic internet access at a greatly reduced cost, available to us outside the evil grasp of Comcast. They are begging for people to sign up, and nobody knows. Why? Because the outreach is terrible. I will sit here and scream about it for hours on end, and I would bet you that a majority of your customers who are business only in highly focused areas like the Commons are the only ones available for OpenCape, and they still don't know about it. So this is an ongoing problem that we continue to have is, one, what can we do about the interconnections? There are 98 properties currently occupied in Washington Valley Estates. 2 are currently being built. Washington Valley Estates is going to be completely built. After that, La Cava is building his other 48 properties next to the golf course. That's more than likely an easy connectivity or interconnect for the existing systems that we have, albeit private, public, whatever the ownership is. What is the capabilities of us to attach these smaller systems or these micro systems, as we talk about microgrids for electrical, another revenue source that we could look at doing, as well as did once to facilitate fiber optic distribution in the Cape, put some money into the local infrastructure away from the giants like Comcast, as well as maybe bury our existing infrastructure, such as our electrical systems that we've always talked about. So how can we interconnect these existing systems to improve that, one? And two, like you're saying, the townspeople don't want to spend the money because they don't know how big the issue is. They don't know how loud this alarm bell rings. You know, the kids are out there in front of the bakery, the Washershore bakery, volunteering, raising money, all this stuff. Why are the wastewater treatment groups not out there saying, hello, we need to make this noise? Why aren't these studies being made available? how difficult it was for me to find the information about the wastewater treatment for the Cape for Mashpee alone. It's nearly impossible. It's yeah, not easily discoverable, and
So-
nobody's notified.
So
I don't know.
let me start. So the first thing, talking about the connections to the trail. So that was a fairly common theme that came up during our visioning exercises that we started last fall. And as we start looking at solutions, and we aren't the only solution, we're part of the solution in the town. We look at short-term and long-term goals. And one of the short-term goals for us is to start figuring out how to make these existing trails, these existing paths, how do we make them mapped so that people can find them, so that people do know that there is another form of transportation other than driving to Mashpee Commons to get here. As far as making people aware, part of the reason that we have been holding this whole Mashpee Commons by Design process with the visioning sessions and these Tuesday talks is really to start trying to help facilitate that conversation, to help people start to understand what are some of the challenges that we face here in the town of Mashpee, and really regional, housing, infrastructure, finance, zoning. All these things are, we're doing this hopefully as a partner with the town and with the Cape Cod Commission to really try and get the information out there to people. We're soliciting input. We want folks to come in and learn about these issues. So, hopefully you've been able to attend some of the other events. I do believe that they're all available online. We've done Facebook Live at all the visioning sessions, all of our meetings with the town. All these Tuesday talks have been on Facebook Live. So if you haven't been able to attend them, I believe you can go back and find them on YouTube. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah. You want a really honest answer to your question?
Yeah.
The really honest answer is, the public gets the governance it deserves and demands. And so, I said this last year when I was running for Selectman, not one person in the entire campaign cycle came up to me and said one word, asked one question about water quality. So guess what? We didn't really talk about it very much. My opponents didn't talk about it very much. If people think it's important and ask about it and bitch about it, then you'll get the rest of us who choose to run to office to pay attention to it. People in elected office pay attention to the things they hear about, unless they really personally care about an issue. I spend my time on the wastewater issue because I care about it. I don't get a lot of traction or support around the rest of my board. It's not what they get up in the morning thinking about, and nobody in the rest of the town makes them think about it one bit. So that's part of the answer. The other part of the answer is, people come to these things, in a way you're playing with the wrong people. Because people will say, you people who are presenting on a particular issue do a crappy job communicating with us about the issue. A, we're here talking about the issue. And B, just because you know the technical part, or you know how to make the financing work, or you know this element or that element of it, doesn't make you a communications expert. And a lot of times, and I can't tell you how many times somebody who has expertise in communication has chastised me for not communicating on an issue very well, and yet the only time I ever hear from them is when they're bitching at me about the fact that I don't communicate well. They very rarely come in and follow up and say, I know how to do this, let me help you. Right. So part of my answer is, everybody's busy doing the best they can, and what do you want if other people aren't going to get involved and help with the lift?
Which is the answer is appreciated. I guess the bigger thing is, as I said, I'm stuck here. So what can I do to improve this now?
You remember APCC? Join us. It takes resources. It takes human resources and it takes money resources to move these issues forward.
And encourage other people to get
And there will be 110 people that are going to show up at town meeting in a couple of Mondays and spend $56 million of your money. I know you'll be there. You're usually there. But I'm not quite sure where the other 14,400 and whatever people are, and I sure as hell don't think that a majority of them think we're doing a bang-up job and don't have something, but they don't show up. So things are run by the majority of the people who show up, which is a really small number.
So you had your hand up, and then
Prior to this gentleman bringing it up, I had wanted to talk a little bit about broadband, because that's one of the utilities that hasn't been mentioned at this meeting, and I'm sure it's on the radar, but I'm a real advocate for broadband development because of the field I came out of, which was satellite communications. I'm somewhat familiar, actually more than somewhat familiar with OpenCape, even though I don't work for them. They're not available to residential users at this time, and I was going to encourage Mashpee Commons, I'm assuming you've had conversations with OpenCape about how to bring their service into the Commons, but the infrastructure, as I understand it, isn't built out underground here at the Commons, except maybe in the new section. Is that correct?
We have had conversations with OpenCape.
Yeah.
All of our infrastructure is underground. It doesn't necessarily work with how OpenCape needs to bring their infrastructure to individual buildings.
That's all I mean. I know your utilities.
That's the roadblock that we would run into. It would be expensive for us to go in and add all new infrastructure, and the existing infrastructure, it doesn't get where they need to go.
Right. So the ability for Mashpee Commons commercial and residential users to sign up for OpenCape doesn't currently exist in a cost-effective way. I mean, nothing is impossible.
Right. All infrastructure problems are solved.
Right.
They're not reasons to not develop. They're just cost.
Yeah, they have a web presence where you can tell them about your interest, but that doesn't make the infrastructure interconnection a fact.
Correct.
And then the other, so the point I'm trying to make though is I do believe that one way or another, all of us need to be advocates for broadband because we live in a knowledge economy. And I would venture to guess that everybody in this room has one of these in their hand, and if you don't, you're in the minority. And you use the internet either knowingly or unknowingly every day. And so this economy can't exist without a growing broadband infrastructure, and you can ignore it, but it's just like wastewater. You ignore it at your peril in terms of the economy.
Well, technology is an interesting thing in itself, not just necessarily broadband, but technology.
Right.
And simply by the fact that the old way that it used to work is a job would locate and people would go to the job. It's sort of a reverse of that right now, where jobs are located where the people are. And so if there's technology and there's people, then the jobs are going to come to the people. So, I mean, it's something that we do. You're correct, we did not bring it up as a component of the infrastructure discussion tonight, but it is certainly something that we talk about as a way to figure out how to continue to grow the economy of Cape Cod.
Just Tom, and we're kind of biased towards this corner of the room. Does anyone over here have questions that hasn't said anything yet?
I do, Mike, because I gotta go and watch NCIS.
Okay, Tom.
It's just one thing, you mentioned, your tradition. The sewer commission is a 7-member commission. We have 4 members. We have to have all 4 have a quorum. There are 3 empty seats on the sewer commission. If you want to get involved, become a member of the sewer commission. Let's look at a point that. The sewer commission was created back in the 80s because the public was so concerned about the water quality in the rivers and the bays. That was pushed by the public all along through the 90s, this watershed years. So it's not something that's been not unknown to anybody. It's a conference sneaking up on anybody with this wastewater issue. It's been a public issue from day one. I don't know how long you've lived in the town, but a lot of the great advocates have actually died since moved out of town, and so we've lost some of the people with the great voices. But there's a lot of room to get involved if you're really concerned, particularly with the wastewater. Well, to see a couple more sewer commissioners.
So they should email Andrew.
Sure. Actually, the sewer commission doesn't even have a computer or any staff.
We're running out of time.
All right, sir.
I would just say that for the last few houses that can be built in Mashpee should be required to have at least the fiber going from the house out to the street, so that it makes the connection easier. Rather than
That's the resiliency question of how do you make this infrastructure future-proof to a certain degree.
I mean, it would make OpenCape's decision to put Cape fiber there easier if they knew they were already connecting up the house and it's kind of cheap.
So I've got a question sort of that kind of ties together a few of these comments is, it seems like a lot of this is sort of retrofitting past decisions and patterns that in this kind of a suburban experiment a lot of people have been talking about for the last 20 years or so. So here on Cape Cod, it also ties into the way we develop under the streets as well, with the lack of sewer and wastewater. And so I'm wondering, not to get bummed out about that length of time, sort of like 10 years to get a couple miles of road fixed. What are you all seeing on how to accelerate this sort of infrastructure improvements? And is it, what are the ways that we can use as a community to do that?
Litigation and money.
I think coordination as well.
Health crisis.
I think we've seen some places where you'll do a road project and then they want to put pipes under the ground. You have to wait 5 years to open it up. Now, communities like Orleans are putting pipes under a road project. There's no full plan for where the pipes are going to go, but they've got that part done. So trying to coordinate can help in certain instances.
Yeah, I think that, all kidding aside, that, Tom's right, Mashpee's been looking at this issue since the 80s, which is both a blessing and a curse. The fact that we're still not that far along in getting things done from where we started back in the 80s is pretty damning, but it's also pretty reflective of the experience of the Cape. Why did the Cape as a group of communities move on wastewater 10 years ago? Because it got sued.
Right.
Same reason that Boston fixed its metropolitan wastewater infrastructure, because they got sued. And so, all goodwill aside, you got to force people to find a way to raise these issues up on the priority level, and then you have to find ways to help them finance it, because you can't get blood from a stone. So if the answer was that the litigation from CLF on the Cape, you're going to build infrastructure, and it's going to cost everybody on the Cape $4,800 a year per head to build the infrastructure, you could lose the case but not get your outcome, because you can't get $4,800 a year out of somebody. So you have to come in and figure out some way to make the funding available, and that's what this trust fund does. That's what some of the other things do. So, but, people aren't going to do it until, I don't think, until they're forced to do it. You look at all the major public policy initiatives that have happened, they come out of some form of litigation these days, because somebody's liable for something.
I think it's also, understanding that we're working together to solve these issues. It's not the town or the commission dictating and mandating. We've tried to be a partner with these groups for a very long time, and I think when public and private entities work together, it helps things get done.
Sometimes help the money come as well. I know when we finished the Mashpee Rotary study, we're going to have a whole host of recommendations, but nothing's going to move until the money comes. So you can try to do as much grassroots, but you're going to need someone really pushing the project all the way up to political change. We're going to talk about big dollars.
Our state rep 30 years ago said that the state wasn't going to do it for Rotary until for at least 20 years.
Well, let's do that, right?
That was 10 years ago.
Right, so we're getting close on time here. I want to respect everyone's evenings. Any closing thoughts here? I know we're kind of going to go into a really intense period starting May 3rd. Any sort of questions, final questions we should try and answer that week?
I mean, from my perspective, I just hope that we continue to have this involvement. Again, we're trying to get the public's input to help us with this process. So hopefully we'll see a lot of these cases again during that week.
I guess I would add that I think it's clear from tonight that the way we've developed in the past, sprawl, is very expensive for infrastructure. So it's clear we need something different, but I think different can be frightening to residents on the Cape. So I certainly encourage these sort of activities where you try to get people out and get people comfortable with something new. Because doing what we've done in the past won't work, so we have to get together around something new.
I would close by saying, to the extent people participate in this process, that's great. You need to show up at some selectmen meetings and make some noise. I don't care whether it's this discussion or something else, because not that much of that spills over into what we deal with on a week-to-week basis.
Yeah.
So,
On Mondays?
Huh?
Mondays?
Roughly every other Monday.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you tonight. Thanks everyone for